thank you, Lee, for that introduction. And you have to be careful. That might be the gift that keeps giving, because I may be sending students your way, given that you've aspired to those interconnections. It's really wonderful to be here, and thank you, Lee, for that introduction, as well as it's wonderful to meet you. In fact, 2019 was the first time we met after so many years, yet we had a range of people in common. And I'd like to also thank Brian Sykes and the Criminology Law and Society program, the department, for the invitation to present in this 2018-19 lecture series. Of course, it's wonderful to be back in Southern California and to be at Irvine. It's been a very long time since I've visited. I was trying to rack my brains to remember, and I think it was 2003, 2004, and so very, very long time. And it's good to be here amongst friends. I see some familiar faces. So the talk that I'll present today is, of course, from my forthcoming book, Affective Justice. It's also part of a forthcoming article with Polar. And the book is coming out with Duke later this year in November. And what I've decided to present is toward the theory of international justice, or toward an anthropology of international. I think the justice got cut off, but that should say justice. And so it's really an attempt to map the framework for this much larger and quite wieldy project. Let me just say a few things about methods, because people often ask, and it's worth considering how one does both qualitative and some quantitative work over a 6-year period in this realm. Of course, I started this work much longer than prior to the 6-year period that I was simply focusing on the questions at play. I started really with an interest in 1998 with the signing of the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, and then that, of course, resulted in the first book on the ICC that I wrote, Fictions of Justice. But in 2012, I applied for an NSF and received an NSF to do a 3-year project that involved fieldwork in 4 different sites. So at the ICC in The Hague in the Netherlands, in Addis Ababa, as well as in Kenya and Nigeria. And we spent, a lot of that early work was qualitative and quantitative, so it involved interviews. We did 300 interviews, ran a number of focused groups, and then a lot of it was qualitative. It involved immersion in this field, this ominous field of international justice. And in my capacity, in many ways as a researcher initially, and then later moving into the 4th year when I was going back between teaching and other things and short breaks from teaching, working as a technical advisor for the African Union with the legal office, the Office of Legal Counsel, they call it. And it was in the midst of significant crises, etc., which I'll talk about today. But the final 3 years after the NSF was over, the Open Society gave us a quite generous, we had a 3-year grant that was over $1 million to do the second half of this work. And much of that work, a lot of it was quite, I was deeply engaged as a participant, as it were, while at the same time doing field research, but also working as an advisor to the court and working on, for example, the African Union's withdrawal strategy to try to figure out a way to put in place a particular strategy. So if people want to talk about the way that the fieldwork unfolded over time, I would be happy to do that toward the end. So the talk then, what I'll present is basically an attempt to map out the theoretical framework for this conceptualization of affective justice and what it means to do this type of work in this climate and to think about the affective domains of justice. And I'm going to read a good portion of it and then talk through some of it, so excuse the reading of the text. So on April 27, 2007, the International Criminal Court, which I'll refer to as the ICC, issued arrest warrants against the militia leader and Sudan's Minister of Humanitarian Affairs, Ahmed Haroun. And then on July 14th, 2008, the ICC prosecutor requested an arrest warrant against Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, and that, of course, was issued on March 4th, 2009. So the Rome Statute, of course, came into force in July 2002, and it's one of those institutions that is engaged in the growth of the production of a multilateral treaty order that enables the jurisdictional reach of international legal institutions and their associated liberalist principles. The court's much vaunted call for an end to impunity is represented through its moral discourse of supporting victims through the pursuit of those seen as most criminally responsible, including heads of state. Under the Rome Statute for the ICC, state actors under the jurisdiction of the court have agreed to suspend their sovereignty over the adjudication of particular international crimes. And that, of course, is in theory. And so the idea is that they've instead ceded that responsibility to the ICC. The popular expectation is that states under the ICC's jurisdiction will be held responsible for protecting the lives of their citizens from mass atrocity violence, thereby committing to ending the impunity of those who are seen as having evaded justice for too long. By attributing to high-ranking leaders, rather than what is often seen as lower-level actors, the responsibility for mass atrocity violence, the ICC has perhaps done more than any other international institution to promote the need for an end to impunity. But it has also borne the brunt of significant critiques in response to local controversies, all the while calling attention to its selection strategies and legitimacy. One such controversy has emerged because court agents can trigger its jurisdiction through a state self-referral for investigation and possible prosecution under Article 13A of the Rome Statute. However, given that upper-level leaders are unlikely to investigate their own action honestly, jurisdiction can also be triggered through the prosecutor's own initiative. And that's Article 13C, as well as a referral by the United Nations Security Council, so the UNSC, and that's through Article 13B. The latter, that is 13B, the trigger through the UN Security Council, has been controversial because they also involve referrals of non-state parties that themselves have not consented to the Rome Statute's jurisdiction, like the US, for example. It's also controversial because more than half of the states that are permanent members of the UN Security Council, the United States, China, Russia, have refused to suspend sovereignty and submit to their states to the jurisdiction of the ICC. But since its inception in 2002 until early 2019, the ICC has pursued 22 cases in 9 situations. These are the subject matter jurisdiction of the court. So since its inception, the ICC has pursued 22 cases in 9 situations across African states: Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Ivory Coast, Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, the Republic of Mali, and Libya. It has issued indictments for 36 individuals, including 27 arrest warrants and 9 summonses to appear before the court. From the cases of alleged African warlords to indictments of African leaders such as President Uhuru Kenyatta and Deputy President William Ruto of Kenya, President Omar al-Bashir of Sudan, Laurent Gbagbo of the Ivory Coast, the predominance of African defendants before the court has, of course, led to suspicion about the fairness of prosecutorial justice. Growing members of African and other post-colonial stakeholders have begun to see that anti-impunity rule of law discourses might be and are, according to them, highly biased and uneven. This was especially the case following the ICC's the ICC judge's recent refusal to accept the prosecutor's request for authorization to begin an investigation into whether crimes were committed in Afghanistan by the US military. So very recently, this past month. In response to perceived structural, so of course these are the indicted heads of state that I referred to earlier, and just some of the statistics that I mentioned earlier, 22 cases, 39 indictments. So in response to this perceived structural injustice, some African leaders, such as the Rwandan President Paul Kagame, have offered passionate utterances as when stated that the ICC appears to have been, quote, put in place only for African countries, only for poor countries. Every year that passes, I am proven right, he says. Rwanda cannot be part of colonialism, slavery, and imperialism, end quote. This comment, made in the context of President al-Bashir's indictment in 2009, reflects the perspective of many on the continent who have begun to perceive the ICC not as a mechanism for a more hopeful future, but rather as a force that seeks to continue a long and tragic history of exploitation, racism, and, as they see it, external control of African states and economies. When the ICC prosecutor issued the arrest warrant for al-Bashir in 2009, it marked the first time that the UN Security Council had invoked its referral power under the Rome Statute, and that was the ability to refer a particular situation to the ICC prosecutor. The referral predicated on the UN Security Council's determination that the situation in Sudan had constituted a threat to international peace and security under Article 39 of the United Nations Charter, and that prosecution of the perpetrators of human rights violations in Darfur would help to restore peace and security in that region. The government of Sudan, though, objected to the exercise of this jurisdiction, arguing that both the UN Security Council and the ICC violated the country's sovereignty. Given that Sudan had not at all ratified the Rome Statute for the ICC and therefore had not consented to suspending its sovereignty. In immediate reaction to the arrest warrant against al-Bashir, the Sudanese government expelled more than a dozen humanitarian aid organizations and workers, leaving more than 1 million people without access to food, water, and healthcare services, creating controversy and further complicating peace negotiations that were underway. So in addition to the Sudanese government, the Arab League, the Organization of Islamic Conference, and some members of the UN Security Council, most notably China, also objected to this arrest warrant. For its part, the AU responded by requesting that the UN Security Council defer the ICC prosecution against al-Bashir, arguing that a legal process would undermine ongoing regional peace efforts in which al-Bashir was actively participating, end quote. The UN Security Council responded minimally to the request. Many of you might remember this moment, considering it for only briefly and in the end declining to act on it. And when the UN Security Council refused, the AU called on its members not to cooperate with the ICC's order. So that the state agents of the AU, initially strong supporters of the ICC, have recently adopted an oppositional stance is especially telling. The AU, of course, is the largest Pan-African organization with an expanding mandate to achieve greater unity, solidarity, political cooperation, and socioeconomic integration for African peoples. In regard to President al-Bashir's indictment, the AU insisted that the search, quote, the search for justice should be pursued in a way that does not impede or jeopardize efforts aimed at promoting lasting peace. It also reiterated a concern about, quote, the possible misuse of indictments against African leaders. In the end, of course, what ended up happening is that the UN Security Council denied the AU's request, and this, of course, in 2011 resulted in the AU's decision not to cooperate with the arrest and surrender of al-Bashir, so the surrender of him to The Hague and to the ICC. And since then, he has been traveling up until very, very recently as president, traveling to various African member states without arrest. And even with the recent military coup in Sudan that led to the end of al-Bashir's 30 years of rule through an army-led transition, African leaders have continued to insist that ICC indictment should not necessarily lead to regime change. Instead, they insisted that if al-Bashir is to be prosecuted, it would not, and I quote, "it would not involve handing him over to outsiders, such as those involved with the ICC." And so as of this moment, spring 2019, the controversy is ongoing and is part of a broader debate about international justice. That is, who has the power to name it, deliver it, and why, and of course is at the center of what I refer to as affective justice. So how do justice institutions like the ICC operate with effectiveness and force when it doesn't have universal jurisdiction, enforcement power, a police force, a military, or the assumed loyalty of a citizenry, or as one would expect of a state, perhaps? And so in this talk, I show that it actually works by deploying embodied affects, emotional regimes, and what I call technocratic forms of knowledge in a mode of embodied regimented practice called affective justice. And this, I argue, is central to the power of international justice institutions and the meanings of justice that they propagate. Now, notions of justice have tended historically to be mapped out against three broad categories of understanding: philosophical, analytical, and often, and of late, practice-oriented. The contributions of Jacques Derrida and Jean Rawls have been especially important in developing a coherent philosophical understanding of justice as a domain by which fairness is established through rights and duties, and in relation to achieving justice through the law. As an analytic category, justice has been understood as an expressive domain through which people organize their ideas about what is morally right and fair, as well as what is ethical. When understood in terms of practice, justice is often seen as being produced and challenged by the materiality of people's actions through which meanings of justice are lived. Now, anthropologists have long engaged in documenting practice-oriented meaning-making and how notions of appropriateness and inappropriateness are produced through sociocultural behavior. Yet philosophical and analytic perspectives have been privileged often in discussions of international justice, and the contributions of an anthropological focus on practice have been far less prominent. This talk begins to address that gap by illuminating how affects as embodied practices shape emotional responses, and how those responses can, through the intensity of their force, produce international justice in particular ways. Affective justice seeks to eliminate, and so as a framework, it seeks to eliminate an important process that has remained obscure in the theorizing of international justice. That is, how various forms of legal, political, and economic instrumentalism have produced the force of law, socio-moral affects, and embodied practices that constitute international publics. So affective justice then is the term that I advance for understanding people's embodied engagements with and production of justice through particular structures of power, history, and contingencies. Central to it are the ways that affects as embodied responses constitute publics by dislodging identity from its classification domain and relocating them as lived experiences played out through particular feeling regimes. These feeling regimes highlight what people do with emotions and are connected not only to affects and their subjectifications, but also the biopolitical strategies through which life and its human possibilities are managed. So what I'll show is that this happens under regimes of knowledge and power, through which law and technocratic and capitalist processes are indeed deployed. So seeing international justice through these processes demonstrates that contemporary international justice mobilizations do not gain their power through singular formalized lawmaking processes. So in other words, it's not criminal law or the Rome Statute as the object of its force that gives its force. So part of the argument is that they gain their power through emotional imaginaries, through embodied moral responses to perceptions of injustice. I show that this happens through devices that are used to expand, displace, and end injustice, thereby innovating new formations, even as people and institutions, people engaged in various institutions build on old ones. So in an attempt to shape justice institutions and conceptions of justice, the ICC or even the African Union, agents of the African Union, non-governmental advocates, civil society activists vie for control of social norms or challenge those norms to produce new ones. Seen through the remit of the ICC, affective justice then reflects the way that people come to understand, challenge, and influence legal orders through biopolitical forms of instrumentalization, or the instrumentalization of technocratic knowledge, which I'll talk about in a moment, as well as through various affective embodiments and interjections and social actions. Yet international justice, like other forms of justice, is often presumed to be outside of these realms of practices and of this realm of or the practice of construction. It is seen by many of its advocates as objective and non-prejudicial, with precedents that are external to cultural, political, and precognitive scrutiny. In the realm of cognition, a growing number of contemporary brain scientists, for example, have argued that the mind responds to precognitive sensory impressions and processes them through culturally appropriate and emotional responses. And so in many ways, even though this research doesn't use tests that look at these processes of precognition, it certainly gains inspiration from this literature in thinking about the way that humans translate precognitive affects into hyperlocal cultural terms of understanding that are in turn expressed through emotions and regulated socially and adopted into actionable concepts. And so affective justice then as a concept posits that emotional articulations of bodily processes is a critical link connecting the precognitive body to the making and unmaking of socio-legal and political institutions, and that this side of translation can be examined through observations of how affects are legally materialized discursively and performatively. So in part what I'm saying is that the focus here and my interest is the materialization of these bodily manifestations, that there are limits empirically for social science in trying to understand these interior processes. It's simply what we see and how we understand their manifestations that is of interest here. And so affective justice then explores how justice making is enmeshed in bodily affects that give rise to emotional expressions, as well as the invocation of various racialized iconic figures, which we'll consider as well if we think about the numbers of indictments against Africans. What is the racialized figure? The fact that the victims are all black women, children, men. The perpetrators are black men, Muslim men, brown people. What are the bodily affects that are part of that, and how does that become manifest socially? Okay, so let me look at a case example to think this through, and then map out what the theoretical, what the framework is that I'm using here to make sense of it. Okay, so here of course it's the materialization emotional regimes and these affective interior processes that interest me. And so let's think about what happened in relation to, I'm going to return to the story about al-Bashir and Sudan to think about the AU's response and how this was emotionally manifest and what it says for how we think about affective justice. So following the AU's declaration of non-cooperation with the ICC's call to arrest and surrender President al-Bashir of Sudan, a number of developments unfolded in summer 2012 when the former president of Malawi, who had committed to hosting the next AU's biannual summit in Lilongwe, died suddenly. The newly appointed president, Joyce Banda, at the time, aware of the ICC's call for the arrest and surrender of al-Bashir, was expected by the international justice community, was expected not only to host the summit, but to issue final invitations to all 53 members of the African Union, so all of the member states and their presidents. And she was expected to issue, especially among Pan-Africanists, the invitation to al-Bashir. Now, as a new president, Banda began her term by entering into partnerships with a range of international donors. Many of her US-based donors, when they heard that Banda was going to issue invitations to everyone, including President al-Bashir, who was wanted by the International Criminal Court, they threatened to cancel her financial commitments if al-Bashir was allowed to enter Malawi without arrest. To them, a visit would signify Malawi's unwillingness to fulfill its good governance commitments. With Malawi's economic constraints in mind, President Banda announced to the AU leadership that if President al-Bashir were to attend the 19th AU summit in Malawi, her country would have no choice but to fulfill its ICC obligations and arrest and extradite him to The Hague. According to Banda, quote, Malawi is already going through unprecedented economic problems, and it would not be prudent to take the risk by allowing one person to come and attend the summit against much resistance from our cooperating partners and donors, end quote. Rather than stopping at disinviting al-Bashir and affirming an obligation to arrest him, rather than doing that, President Banda disinvited the leaders and advisors of all 53 AU member states. Within the next 4 days, the summit was relocated to the AU headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and new invitations were issued to heads of state, including President al-Bashir. Now, Ethiopia, so this is an important, one of many high-profile developments around the unwillingness to extradite al-Bashir. Ethiopia set a precedent that has been replicated at subsequent summits. At the most recent summit, in the June 2015 summit, South Africa declined to turn over al-Bashir to the ICC. And given South Africa's status as a BRICS country and its recent history of human rights promotion and constitutionalism, the development was curious to many onlookers who had expected the state to embrace its international treaty obligations. And in summer 2016, the controversy over ICC expectations of African states peaked at an AU ministerial meeting when delegates discussed the contradictions of the duty to prosecute and the status of requested ICC amendments. And so in many of these meetings, the ministers complained bitterly about what they saw as inequality in the ICC, especially related to its referrals through the 5 permanent member states of the UN Security Council, which they said lacks African representation. Articulating positions in animated and colorful language, they took issue with the overall focus of the ICC on selecting African cases and insisted that this perceived bias has political consequences. To the chagrin of many African human rights civil society organizations working for predominantly Western-funded NGOs. The debates were invigorated by angry civil society demands for checks and balances against unchecked African governmental power. Leaders met this criticism by publicly calling out the imperial continuities of international legal injustice. The result inspired the call for a coordinated strategy for African states to advance a collective withdrawal from the Rome Statute that established the ICC. What unfolded were emotionally driven expressions of dissatisfaction, leading to 3 African states to declare their intentions to withdraw. And in much of the larger book, I look at the discourses that are used around this withdrawal strategy. So the invocation of the ICC as an extension of colonialism, the articulations of the ICC as an injustice that's manifest in international law, but also a contrary or a counter discourse that is the invocation of the freedom fighter. So the development of a discourse around the African Union and as a Pan-Africanist organization, as an organization that is for the people, as an organization that is a manifestation of African independence fighters and freedom fighters. So while the ICC, the imagery often propelled, represents that of the freedom fighter, I'm just going to go to that imagery. So the Pan-African dyad, the idea of from colonialists to freedom fighters, and on your bottom right, there we see Jomo Kenyatta, Uhuru Kenyatta's father, who was the leader of independent Kenya. And he too was indicted by the British colonial forces, and ultimately gained his freedom and through public protests, and led to the negotiated independence of Kenya. And some 50 years later, the ICC indicts his son, who then becomes the president of Kenya. And so part of what the larger project does is to look at the imagery and the way that on one hand a colonial dyadic manifestation is part of the rhetoric description of the ICC, and how everyday people as well as high-level leaders engage in a discursive strategy that reattributes guilt from the kind of harms that may in fact have been done by African leaders, and that reattributes it to the different kinds of imagery, so the freedom fighter, etc. Okay, so I'm going to go back to that in a moment, but what is the response to this kind of imagery and the invocation of the contextual past and the replacement of that past with these Pan-Africanist figures? Well, various organs of the ICC, such as the presidency and the office of the prosecutor, are consistently responding to these controversies and challenges by shoring up and projecting the core logic of legal accountability as the sole appropriate and objective strategy for ending impunity in Africa as well as elsewhere. For the fiction of sovereignty remains at the center of state processes. Participation in the Rome Statute treaty system is voluntary, but when states are seen as signing and then ratifying any treaty to establish, in this case, an international criminal court, what they're seen as doing is taking responsibility for pursuing the crimes under the jurisdiction of the court, as well as cooperating to adjudicate the crimes under the Rome Statute. And we see this in Article 17 of the Rome Statute, which clarifies that if member states have ratified the Rome Statute and they're unwilling and unable to genuinely investigate a case under the jurisdiction of the court, then the ICC can claim jurisdiction of that case, thereby leading to the suspension of that country's sovereignty over that particular act that's seen as a criminal act. Now, it's this biopolitical architecture, this legal and this vying over the control and management of the life and the management and adjudication of crimes that provides the framework for the 123 states under the court's remit that have ratified the statute. 1/3 of them are African states. But in order for this technocratic structure to work, the ICC operates through ideas, through convictions, through willing memberships, and some forms of coercion that travel, take root, and circulate in various ways. And so, in other words, the ICC isn't simply building a building or its capacity to host criminal trials. It is not just about a single location or a single set of founders or judges. Its work is far-reaching and multifarious. Its beginning and end go well beyond the Rome Statute. Its legal actions precede the making of the Rome Statute, and it follows violence as well as is constituted by such violence. The global circulation of rule of law actors and actants is centrally propelled by moral convictions to save victims and to stop perpetrators of violence. This mission operates through moral embodiments in which political commitments against impunity are central to how the component parts of the assemblage function. Yet morality, emotion, and embodied feelings about injustice are core components of the movement's power. The ICC routinely individualizes collective violence through the projection of the figure of the victim in relation to the figure of the perpetrator. For example, the Gambian lead prosecutor for the ICC, which is on the slide ahead, she has publicly asserted that the Rome Statute is her Bible. Quote, "It is not about politics, but the law." End quote, she said, at a public forum in Albany, New York in April 2012, as she was transitioning from deputy prosecutor to the lead prosecutor of the court. And then later she insisted, "I will use the law to uphold justice." In emphasizing the court's mandate for justice centers on serving victims through legal accountability, she later argued. We should, and I quote, "We should not be guided by the words and propaganda of a few influential individuals whose sole aim is to evade justice," she says, "but rather we should focus on and listen to the millions of victims who continue to suffer from massive crimes. The return on our investments for what others may today consider a huge cost for justice is effective deterrence and saving millions of victims' lives," end quote. And so Prosecutor Bensouta's performative plea for ICC justice was delivered in this case, clearly, and in many others that we've analyzed, in the name of the victim. Deploying what I call a sentimental legalism, her narrative construction follows a liberalist legal discourse that works through what I call legal encapsulation. That is, it equates justice with the law and invokes a mission of protecting victims against powerful perpetrators who have enjoyed impunity for too long. This discourse of saving victims by making high-ranking perpetrators individually responsible through judicial trials, in effect links the notion of protection and by extension prevention to a very particular application of legal justice. It serves as a sympathizing strategy and neatly collapses the protection of victims with the rejection of impunity for perpetrators. And that reifies the legal tool of holding perpetrators accountable as the sole appropriate mechanism for justice. So ICC justice sentimentalism often presumes an objective and often colorblind indifference as a fundamental operating principle. This means that for the ICC, the racial politics of African indictments are decentered from the public discourse, yet the visual practices of seeing race, however conscious or unconscious, are still part of the affective landscape that are discursive and representational politics of the victims and the perpetrator have the impact of precluding certain kinds of claims. For if a victim looks like a Holocaust survivor, then victims of colonial violence cannot be recognized as they are. And if the perpetrator looks like a black African man indicted in mass rape or torture, then particular North American or European heads of state may not look like a perpetrator from their desks. These forms of representation serve to demand certain types of actions and priorities, as well as wield military and enforcement power in response to these representations. Such paradoxical presences and absences of racial difference highlight both the imaginary fiction of race and the lived experience of structural violence that can surface in the hidden zones of the unconscious. This dialectics of race, described by Achille Mbembe, is an operation of the imagination, he calls it, in which he argues that it is in these zones of the unconscious that race is both a site of reality and truth, of appearances and a site of rupture and effusion. Its appearances are constituted by the very act of assigning race and produced and institutionalized through the normalization of human typologies in which blackness has been stigmatized. These consequences of race are a function of modernity in which transatlantic slavery led to the violation of particular black bodies, and later colonialism solidified the ways that those bodies would become governed, resulting in subsequent structures that produced the very forms of racial inequalities in the first place. Thus, the accusations of ICC racism by African leaders are not simply a fictional strategic invocation of an imaginary category. They are a resurrection of the fictive horror of racial difference that is still felt to be shaping contemporary life in the body in quite visceral ways. In the realm of ICC indictments of black bodies, then one of the questions is, well, what then is the relevance of the racialized body in relation to how international justice works through figures of victims and of perpetrators? What does studying certain passionate utterances, such as anger, the anger of leaders who themselves have a checkered past, what does that tell us about structural inequality as well as particular responses to them? To understand these processes, then we turn now to how the emotional expressions of feeling link sociality and justice in our globalizing world. And one of the things that we see is that multiple traumas over generations elicit a broad and deep range of emotional responses and show how international law has actually been complicit in the making of African injustice. Just as the agents engaged in the emergent rule of law movement seek to reattribute impunity with persistent justice, so too are these Pan-African justice advocates engaged in reattribution of its products. And this notion of reattribution that I use in the book and in the conceptualization of affective justice is important here, because one of the things that we see in law is this notion of attribution, which has to do with individualizing criminal responsibility, in which what is happening is that we're seeing the parsing of responsibility from the foot soldiers who are actually engaged in committing the crime, the rape, etc., and it's being put onto these high-ranking leaders who should have stopped or are being held responsible for the crime. But the leaders themselves are not necessarily the ones that are stealing the goats, raping the women, etc., but the crime is being attributed to them, and they're being held responsible for those crimes because they could have stopped. And this is the shift in international legal jurisprudence. But what we see is a reassignment, and part of what I'm arguing here is that this reassignment of culpability is a reassignment that we're seeing it is a Pan-African project. It's a reallocation of culpability where people are saying, no, this is a colonial problem. If you want to think about who is culpable, let's look at 100 years ago when people were made refugees from the land, a la Kenya, a la Zimbabwe. We can look at many, many African contexts in which people feel that the very violence that we're seeing in contemporary electoral arrangements is actually deeply connected to the colonial project and is a manifestation of empire in action. And so this reassignment of justice is a critical one in thinking about what is actually happening in international justice circuits. And this means that in taking seriously these processes, we need to understand what these justice projects actually do and how they do it, and in what way the desires and fantasies about their narratives actually emerge, whether the justice project is the chief prosecutor for the ICC or whether it's a defendant or someone deemed perpetrator. How do these narratives emerge? When people's aspirations produce counter-narratives or counter-vocabularies, and then how then do we make sense of the workings of justice? Now, sociocultural anthropology has long been interested in some of these questions as it relates to emotion and their manifestation, the ways that these forms of parsing happen. But there's one particular anthropologist that I want to take issue to by mapping out the framework that I'm going to end with. And I'll highlight why this is so critical for me and so critical for this project. Now, among legal anthropologists engaged in the study of transitional justice and international court institutions, even those whose texts focus directly on emotively driven practices often miss the opportunity to move beyond frames that individualize emotions and embed them in legal solutions. Richard Wilson's in his book Incitement on Trial, Prosecuting International Speech Crimes, demonstrates this point. Incitement on Trial is about the type of speech practices, what he calls revenge speech, that can contribute to violent crime, and he examines how various armed conflicts are driven by racial, ethnic, national, or religious hatred. By demonstrating the need to address the relationship between speech acts and various mass atrocity crimes, the optic of analysis is focused on how particular speech acts contribute to crimes against humanity and genocide. It highlights the role of ordering in the perpetration of mass atrocity violence and argues that incitement should be seen as a form of complicity, in turn leading to criminal liability. So in advocating a framework for monitoring political speech, his book rethinks notions of criminal liability as a measure for culpability. Further work by Richard Wilson, such as his essay titled The Anthropology of Justice After Atrocity, also illustrates this focus on individualized criminal culpability. Wilson is concerned with criminal liability, hate speech, and post-atrocity violence, and argues that not only have human rights become the central language of justice worldwide, but the survivors of mass atrocity violence want legal accountability for such atrocity violence. By mapping a literature of various approaches to the anthropology of international justice that reorient justice in broader terms, he argues that given that survivors use human rights language to advocate the legal accountability of political leaders who commit those crimes, analysts need to pay attention to the calls for legal accountability for perpetrators of violence. And so here we see his development of a framework for recuperating survivors of violence against various offending political elites. And this kind of legally triumphant approach depends on a presumption of a victim-survivor versus a perpetrator dyad. And so here, my point of departure from this approach is that as morally important as it is to support the cause of survivors of violence, the dyadic survivor versus perpetrator construct advocated in Wilson's approach actually works through the affective and emotional practices that should not be disarticulated from what such emotions do in the world. To omit this analysis and emphasize only survivors as the subject of inequality misses the importance of understanding not only what hate speech does to produce such constructs, but how such speech acts operate within larger domains of power and inequality. By focusing on individualization and relegating to the margins the analysis of the construction of perpetrators of violence as being outside of macro-analysis, Wilson contributes to an anthropology of international justice through the production of a liberal and individuated moral universalism that disarticulates the condition of its making. And so, instead, if we move beyond this individualized approach that privileges the category of the survivor, we might think about an approach to international justice that explores what people do with emotions through the study of international justice assemblages, instead bringing a socio-cultural theorizing of justice into the contemporary moment and considering how affects shape socio-political consciousness and how they're practiced and rendered visible, but also how they reframe constituencies in relation to emotional alignments. And so with this point of departure, what I'm arguing here is that we can move closer to an anthropology of international justice that takes seriously the role of affects by showing how they are embedded and how they are manifest in these emotional expressions. And so here I outline three components, and the slide shows those component parts that are part of that I'm arguing are part of the ways that we need to really make sense of structural inequalities, not simply the category of the victim, but to think about how these things come together in complex ways. And so there are legal technocratic practices, which I'll talk about in a moment, embodied affects, and emotional regimes. And these are the component parts that I'm arguing actually shape international criminal rule of law assemblages. So the first, as we see in the slide, legal technocratic practices, or legal technocratic knowledge, is the domain is primarily concerned with the biopolitical management of life and death. Biopolitics is, of course, understood as exercising power over bodies, ranging from various techniques of subjectification to the control of populations and constituencies, à la Foucault. It involves the management of the population as a political problem, of course, but it also involves the legal basis on which bodies are managed through particular legal, technical measures. And so there should be no surprises there by way of this modality. But what's characteristic in relation to the ICC is that legal technocratic classification is connected to the biopolitical or biopolitical practices. It ties together biology with politics, with technocratic legal practice, in other words. And it's a form of disciplinary power that exists across different scales, that serves to classify populations as well as to classify the basis on which we even think about culpability in the first place. And so this is the first category that's an important category in thinking about affective justice. And if we see this biopolitical process as making international criminal law as the production of a rationalizing regime in which determinants for victims, those classified as victims and those classified as perpetrators, are popularized, then it's important to see this process as central to shaping the basis upon which international legal morality is being normalized. And by extension, how a biopolitics of feeling about those victimized by violence is established through something like narrative, for example. And central to this technocratic process is what I've referred to earlier as legal encapsulation. And this notion of legal encapsulation, of course, I described it earlier. It's a discursive practice that involves the decentering or the centering of the victim and the centering of law as the basis for justice. And by encapsulating that, what it does is it displaces politics. So we saw that in Prosecutor Bensouta's rendition of what the law was meant to do. And increasingly, what we're seeing is a process of legal encapsulation that is shaping the terms on which, the language on which justice in international criminal justice circuits are being understood. And of course, the resultant displacement of the political has implications for those others, especially on the African continent, and the way that the discourses then take shape. So the displacement of the political, for example, Bensouta saying this is not about politics, it's about the law, when in fact the law is constituted through politics historically, that how we understand the law, what is culpable, what the temporal jurisdiction is, all of those things are about the making of a decision, the production of a decision to focus on particular things. And so it's not, of course, objective at all that the law is shaped by social process. So in response to that, we have people that are pushing back, that are reattributing culpability, that are saying, no, it's not about this, it's about that. And so the second component has to do with these embodied affects. So this is the psychosocial, the pre-social, the sensorial, the feeling that you get that is constituted within the biological body. I mean, in my case, when in 1998 I thought the ICC, wow, Rome, the language, the discourses, this is a profound moment. After, by 1993, when Nelson Mandela was freed, African leaders, joined the ICC body because, in fact, in many ways, well, there are many ways, but the moral fortitude of the ICC came to represent the possibility of one day using the law to promote freedom. And if international law was in place when Nelson Mandela or apartheid was at large, then the law could have been used toward great things. And so in many ways, the euphoria of international criminal law for African states was quite incredible. And slowly, from 1994, from 2004, 2005, 2006, as the court started to investigate one African case after the other, one black face after another was indicted by the court, there were particular responses. And this is what embodied affects is about. It's about the bodily response that taps into an emotional feeling that's structural, perhaps, that has to do with how one may respond, that's quite difficult to study socially, but that is manifest in particular ways. And so the final category, emotional regimes, is the manifestation that really is a core component of the framework. And so from the embodied domain to the emotional regime is a key component to thinking about the connection of the first and the second component parts. And following William Reddy, in many ways, the emotional regime, we might think of it as a set of normative emotions and official rituals, practices, and emotions that express and inculcate them. So they're about the necessary unpinning and manifestation of feeling. And so much of the work is interested in particular representational practices. So there may be very much a feeling when you think about a colonial order, and then you look at someone like Jomo Kenyatta, what is the feeling that one gets? There are other feelings that emerge in these regimes. The victim, the category of the victim. So on your left, one of the Boko Haram girls, and some of the others, the girls that were kidnapped by Boko Haram in Nigeria. On the other side is one of the perpetrators before the court, and then the Bring Back Our Girls movement, the international community. What do those figures bring up, and how do those figures get regimented. And this is part of the third framework, or the component parts for thinking about that. We also see the same with freedom fighters, the African Union invoking the figure of the freedom fighters or freedom heroes, all symbolic modalities. In international justice, we often hear the reference to justice now, or the refrain, no one should be above the law, which was the spirit around which the ICC emerged, that after Nazi Germany and the suspension of the law and the decimation of millions of people, including millions of Jews predominantly, the idea is that no one should be above the law, that the law should be used for our purposes. And that appeal, the use and invocation of that discourse to appeal to universalist imaginaries is key to the power and the appeal and the sympathies of international justice. Okay, and so to wrap up then, so far I've talked about legal encapsulation and the response, the forms of reattribution, and the ways that these figures are invoked as the competition around what constitutes international justice. And it's these three interrelated domains, the legal, technocratic, the psychosocial, and these embodied psychosocial, embodied, and emotional regimes that actually come together messily through the rule of law movement to constitute affective justice. As the enmeshment of these component parts, an alliance between the instrumentalization of law and expressive embodiments of its regimes actually propel us to articulate what justice is and to clarify meanings of justice through their materialization. And so approaching international justice in the 21st century in this way allows us to depart from an atomized survivor-perpetrator model or a state-centric theory of sovereignty model around international justice. And instead, it clarifies that international criminal justice should be seen as a site of contemporary contestations that can only be understood as an assemblage of component parts, the parts that are activated and that are part of these complex interrelationships. For international justice cannot be a sacrosanct standalone space for justice making, understood simply within specific localities. In these realms, affects that emerge from a violation or perceived offense produce responses that are irreducible to a singular case. Rather, the ICC, like other domains of justice making, exists within assemblages that are constituted by networks of emergent properties. And in fact, these components are part of what as a part of international justice, function through an assemblage of moral imaginaries, the figures of the perpetrator, the victim survivor, the international community that activate the affective life of international criminal law assemblages. They come into being through particular structuring histories and devices, as well as random alliances. In these spaces of convergence, invocations such as the victim to be saved and the perpetrator to be stopped are deployed as proxies through which law's architecture is retooled, constantly resharpened, and made anew as needed. Thus, and I'll end here, in order to understand the international management of contemporary mass atrocity violence, we must account for how these affective domains actually constitute law's power in ways that congeal but also redirect meanings of justice. So centrally to this argument then is the insistence that metaformations constitute the international criminal justice assemblage in the contemporary period. The formations do not exist through a universalizing global domain in which fairness and equality constitute international justice everywhere. Rather, international justice, as I started with, the provocation is that it gains its power through the various affects that are grounded in deep-seated histories and inequalities, whose dispositions are sometimes already inscribed in people's psychic or emotional worlds. So when attempts to rectify injustice are dislodged from sites of suffering to sites of remediation, they actually have the ability to become aligned with already meaningful moral commitments. So for example, in my response to, as a black woman studying this court and thinking this is a wonderful mechanism, and one moment after moment I continue to see that all the cases are black cases, an already existing sense and experience of social inequality then becomes ignited and is aligned with already meaningful moral commitments. And so whatever that feeling, that innermost feeling might be, those commitments can easily be dislodged. And so much of the much larger project is an analysis of that dislodging and how a feeling that already exists then gets translated within a particular emotional regime and becomes manifest through anger and social protest. And so what we see then to end is that affective justice is not just an essential form of justice that can be applied universally to different contexts, nor is it a form of expression that binds particular social groups and not others. It is a product of immaterial and material practices that find their expression in bodily or social meaning making, materialized through expressions, representations, discourses, and feeling regimes that shape the way that justice is embodied and expressed by people. Affective justice is constituted by complex assemblages that communicate through convergent, itinerant, and even divergent component parts. And I'll end on that note, and happy to take questions. Thank you.
So I will say in CLS, we kind of have a tradition of taking the graduate student question first. So I'll open the floor.
Just circulate that before everybody gets started.
So if there is a graduate student question first, otherwise I just saw she had her hand up. Yeah.
Well, if there are other graduate students, I'm curious. First of all, thank you so much for coming. This is a pleasure having you. I've been a fan for a while. I'm curious about where affective justice could be applied or engaged outside of a sort of court legal institution. I work in Northern Ireland with the lack of a functioning legislature, and a lot of these issues come up but are not necessarily embodied in a framework of effective justice. So I'm curious where effective justice and the court, where the court ends within the effective justice framework, and other lawmaking institutions or not can come in.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a non-graduate student question, right? So, but yes, the starting point would be to understand how things gain their authority and legitimacy. This is the core question that interests me, especially in contexts that presume that authority and legitimacy come through the law, or authority and legitimacy are these mainstream forms of statehood. That actually part of effective justice is to think about what's beneath the structuring mechanism and to make sense of the emotive work that actually produces those things. And its application, I think, is quite widespread to, from something like, I was talking earlier with someone about surrogacy. There's so many domains in which we presume that this is about biology or it's about medicine, etc. But when we need to think about, well, what makes this effective? What makes you want to donate a sperm or an egg, etc.? It doesn't work without the emotive, the moral economy that's part of that. But we often refuse to identify the realm of the emotive, and instead, it becomes this this is sort of universal vision that then is operationalized. So really the question would be, how does a given thing, an institution, a set of practices gain its force? And to think about the nature of the force and to think about what those component parts are. And much of Deleuze and Guattari's work is about the identification of those component parts through which to understand the messy interconnections of those things. And so that would really be the starting place, I think, the starting point of departure anyway.
Yeah, so thank you so much. So as you were speaking, I don't know if this is more of a comment than a question, but I was thinking through the politics of scale as a particularly apt way to think of what you were talking about in terms of redistribution or reattribution. I was thinking could be talked about in terms of not just the politics of who gets to determine the scale of the responsibility in terms of levels of governance or geographical scale, but also temporal scale, like how far are we going to go back? And because I had a harder time following your emotional regime argument, and it seems to me that the embodied affects in the emotional regime are what naturalize the power given to certain circumscriptions around bounded units of scale, right? So somebody thinks that, well, we're just talking from 1998 until now, so why are you bringing up colonialism? And there's a whole set of embodied affects and emotional regimes that makes that a natural circumscription of the problem. So it's just sort of another way of posing what we were talking about that made a little more sense to me, and I wondered if that's what,
Yeah.
that's closer to what you're getting at.
Yes. So part of the argument is that these component parts are interrelated, yeah? And in the book, I actually have a chapter on legal temporalities, which is really about culpability. And much of the data we collected, the interviews, where people in Kenya were saying, no, it shouldn't. The temporal jurisdiction that is designated by the prosecutor shouldn't be 2007, 2008, the 3 days, which is often, when you think about some of the legal charges, to demonstrate that this act of murder, etc., rape, happened during this temporal period. And this is about legal technocratic practice, but it's also about how it gets regimented and how it becomes rudimentary. And so part of the problem is that you have this legal technocratic practice, and you have these emotional regimes that support this idea that the legal prism for determining culpability is this in this period, and instead you have people that are pushing back, that are saying, no, in fact, if we need to go 100 years ago, we need to look at other things that are deeply political, as is the temporal jurisdiction of this case, which is deeply political.
Exactly.
So part of the, I see, I agree fully that legal temporalities is critical for thinking about how legal technocratic practices establish certain regimes of power and knowledge, but they work deeply through these regimes. So to be able to say, on one hand, this is the period for the temporal jurisdiction of this charge, and then to say, victims deserve the truth, right? Victims deserve justice. What does it mean that those things happen together? And that is connected to this feeling that we get, yes, victims deserve justice. Yes, victims should not have to suffer. And these are fundamentally interrelated. And where does it stop? Where does it end? I mean, it's rhizomatic. It's complexly interrelated. And part of what I'm trying to do is to demonstrate the way that the regime of so in this case, let's say the survivor victim, then becomes the way that the technocratic practice is legitimized. And everyone wants to support people who are victimized or survivors. We don't want to not support, but we then have to look at what the problem is around the designation in the first place. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So does that? So there.
I mean, I like what you're doing. I think that the politics of scale gives you more of a sense of who has the power to circumscribe that scale, more so than the rhizomatic model. And I think that if you as a person, if you're living every day the embodied effects of 200 years of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, then you have an entire emotional regime, embodied practices that naturalize the idea that the temporal scale should be longer, right? But that naturalization is happening among people with less power to wield these representations and to put forward these arguments.
Yeah, I mean, I can appreciate the need to insist that we think precisely about who, what institutions, what are the hegemonic alliances that are in place that enable us to deploy this assertion, and that the they is no they, you know, it's about a century-long
Right.
tradition that has inscribed it in particular ways. Part of the challenge with it's a quantitative challenge again about scale, is that it's not precise, that who we are and the categories that we embody are categories that are also part of our imaginary, who we think we are, who people think they see us as, what we perform as the self. And we go in and out of 100 years to the very moment when someone didn't say hello to you, and all of a sudden, you know, that's not about 100 years, that's about, you know, 5 minutes ago, etc. And I think part of I think what's appealing about a rhizomatic model, an assemblage model, is that the kind of promiscuous interconnections that it allows, and at the same time, our need to think precisely about who the actor is and what the nature of the actant is, then gets diffused. And so I take that critique, and I think that we both happen at the same time. And maybe in the other chapters we see, you know, when the book comes out, you'll see more clearly how it plays out through temporal jurisdiction, how it plays out through particular campaigns like the Bring Back Our Girls campaign, how it plays out through the making of an African court, where there are actors who are themselves engaged in this process and others who are recipients of those processes. But you know, we'll see what you think when you're able to look at it more fully.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks.
So yeah, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So thanks so much, Kamari, for your talk.
Yes.
I'd love to hear your thoughts about the decision by the Open Society Institute to issue a grant for a project like this at the time that it did. I think you said, or maybe Lee mentioned, that it was in 2015. And in light of the fact that Open Society itself is a legal technocratic body, what were the concerns it had at the time about the crises of legitimacy of the court?
Okay, great. I'll answer that. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Should I take the second one as
that
well?
makes
And then, yeah.
Thank you. This is a fascinating project. Thank you for, I apologize for my throat. Thank you for doing it and for telling us, for mapping it out for us. I was curious about whether and to what extent you were in conversation with critiques of humanitarianism and human rights discourses more generally, because obviously you mentioned the liberalist conception of human rights. I was obviously thinking about Makabutua, sort of the SBS metaphor all through your talk. And so I'm wondering whether the kind of affective justice that you are identifying, or the kinds with regard to international justice, or ICC specifically, are different from what these critiques of human rights and humanitarianism have to offer. Is it something specific in the political content of the affective responses, something specific about the anti-colonial location? Just those are just my thoughts, but if there's something else, please.
Okay, great. So I'll start with Samar's question then about the Open Society. So how did this come about? Let me just say something about the genesis. In 2000, after the indictment of, so it was Gbagbo, it was al-Bashir, Gbagbo, so multiple African leaders, and then Kenyatta was the last straw, of course, for the AU, and that was when discussions of withdrawals began. That was when Uganda and Kenya were insisting on and wanted to topple the court and began to use this neo-colonial language as a way to talk about the court, the imperial nature of the court, etc. And the African Union then decided to set up its own court, right? And so that was the project that we began to work on. But it was, we called it a protest treaty. So they set up this treaty, we called it a protest treaty because it included all of the components of, meaning the subject matter jurisdiction that was also already part of the Rome Statute, so those 4 crimes, but they added an additional 10 crimes. And those 10 crimes were crimes like drug trafficking. They involved toxic dumping. They involved economic crimes that they saw as crimes of concern to the African continent. They saw these crimes, these ICC crimes, as political crimes, and the other crimes were crimes that actually were economic crimes, piracy, etc. And if you look at unconstitutional change of government, there's a whole list of crimes that were part of that project. But it was written over a 6-month period, and it went through very quickly in 2.5 years. And so we then tried to stop, because this was also the time when they incorporated the language that no sitting head of state can be indicted by the court. And it was at that moment that myself and a collaborator, approached the AU and said, this is a great idea, we agree with the subject matter crimes, but the technical writing of this treaty is deeply problematic. And we did a 200-page analysis of those crimes, and what we saw is some of the challenges with that. And we attended the meeting where the treaty was passed, and also provided them with language to amend some of those provisions that actually made its way into the new, what's called the Malabo Protocol for the African Court. And so eventually they ushered it through. It went through, and it was adopted. This is the Malabo Protocol for the African Court, but it was simply adopted. It needed 15 ratifications. At this present time, it has 11 signatures and 0 ratifications. And so part of the Open Society Grant and the work that we have been doing has involved responding to the question, how do we make this institution better? On one hand, it's responding to these ICC indictments. On the other hand, it's deeply affective. It is about recognizing what the economic and political problems are on the African continent, how to make, criminal corporate culpability is part of is one of the modes in this new statute in the new protocol for the African Court. And so there are ways that African states are saying, we need a mechanism that will serve African purposes, that's not just going to do what the ICC is doing. On the other hand, there are also state agents that want an African court so that they don't have to deal with the Hague. And so there are these geographies of justice that are also part of it. And so the project, the goal was to think critically about the mechanism that was in place and to address what needed to be done to make it better. So that was the work, and that was more applied work which was very much unlike the first 3 years, which was an NSF grant to document, etc. But it certainly gave me the kind of insight that I needed to both appreciate and understand the politics at play. So the second question is about humanitarianism and the critiques of humanitarianism. And Matu is one of my, in many ways, an interlocutor. And to this, so the blunt answer is that this work is clearly in alliance with humanitarianism critiques. But Macau would say that I need to focus more on the anti-impunity movement and less on the Pan-Africanists, that the idea would be to dismiss the kind of Pan-Africanist rhetoric as simply leaders evading justice, especially Kenyatta, and why am I taking it so seriously, etc. And to think about these tools of evasion that are critical to making sense of the play of power in international law. But the critique, the humanitarian realm is quite important, and I'll just end by saying one of the things that I do in one chapter that it engages with this question. There's a chapter on the Bring Back Our Girls campaign, and it's about what I see as, it's about the technocratic practices, it's about emotional regimes, and it's about these embodied domains. And what I demonstrate is why, if we bring back our girls, right, if we follow the rhetoric of bring back our girls, what are we bringing them back to? What are the larger structural conditions in which they are engaged? And so part of what I demonstrate is how the campaign infuses this sense of mobilization alongside Michelle Obama and these celebrities to bring back our girls. Who doesn't want to bring back our girls? We all do. But it's within a very specific circumscribed context. You know, girls' education, being contributors in the capitalist world. The terms are quite specific, and so much of the humanitarian, the critical humanitarian discourse is about that as well. It looks critically at the deployment of particular forms of language, the need to help. You know, you run a mile, you raise $25, and you're the latest radical in town, right? And and so much of humanitarian language is about how the law and how these discourses are deployed to this end. So I demonstrate how the emergence of the we the people, the international community, has become a third prong, and I think I have a slide here of it. The Bring Back Our Girls. So there's the victim, the perpetrator, and the international community, the Bring Back Our Girls. And those components are key figures that propel this justice project in particular ways. The discourse, the language, the categories, they pre-exist and they're available to us to use and deploy without us having to bother with the limited temporal jurisdiction or, you know, the crimes in the first place, that there are these 4 crimes that are political crimes. Apartheid was taken out. There were crimes that were erased in the making of the 4 subject matter jurisdiction components. And these other crimes are crimes that are being reintroduced. So much of it is an attempt to engage it critically and to think about how this happens and how the basis for legitimacy takes shape. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and please join me.